Literary criticism. Criticism during classical period. Plato's criticism on poetry. Plato was of the view that poetry should only exist for the benefit of community. He discussed poetry in his book The Republic, written in 360 BC. He wrote that children who read poetry should not learn about wars and fights. Rather, they should learn about loving each other. Moreover, Plato was of the opinion that good qualities cannot be acquired through poetry or drama. His idea was to ban all the poets except the most high minded ones. He said that poetry should be banned because poets are incapable of telling the truth. Aristotle, the next critic, he wrote on tragedy. Aristotle argued that poetry is a medium of learning and enjoyment. Aristotle's work Poetics, written in 350 BC, is a very influential work of literary criticism in Western literature. Aristotle was of the opinion that poetry should appeal to the emotions of a person. Aristotle defines tragedy through its six component parts: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song. Horace gave his advice on how to write poetry in Ars Poetica. In his satires, he wrote about poetry's place in society. He argued that poetry should not become a trade. Longinus wrote a very popular work on sublimity during the 1st century AD. He was also worried about the fate of poetry. He advised poets to aim for greatness of thought, which is a cause and effect of sublime. Longinus also laid stress on strong and inspired emotions for sublimity. He argued that the sublime is the highest form of literature. Medieval criticism. The word literature first appeared in English language in 14th century. It meant polite learning through reading. The medieval person studied manuscripts rather than books. English Renaissance criticism. Sir Philip Sidney. He wrote the famous work An Apology for Poetry, or The Defense of Poesy. He wrote this work in response to Stephen Gosson's work, The School of Abuse. It was first published in 1595. In this work, Sidney defends poetry by emphasizing on the power of poetry to make men virtuous. He refers to ancient poets to prove his point. Sidney wrote that heroic poetry was of the highest kind. He also made a point that English language was superior to French, Italian, and Spanish languages. Joseph Addison wrote in his essays on the pleasures of imagination, published in 1712, that criticism was becoming more associated with consumption. He compared literary appreciation with the appreciation of other consumer goods. Alexander Pope wrote an essay on criticism. In his verse essay, Pope argues that bad criticism has very harmful effect on literature. He also implied that imitation of ancient poets like Virgil, Homer, Aristotle, Horace, and Longinus is the great standard for taste. Neoclassicism. John Dryden wrote Essay of Dramatic Poesy. Dryden was England's first poet laureate. In this essay, he attempted to justify drama as a legitimate form of poetry. It is a treatise in the form of dialogues between four speakers, Eugenius, Critus, Lycidius, and Neander. The four men discuss three topics. First, the relative merit of classical drama versus modern drama. Second, whether French drama is better than English drama. Third, whether plays in rhyme are an improvement upon blank verse drama. The observation was that French observe Aristotle more carefully than the English. They depict only one action, whereas the English burden their plays with underplots. The tendency of English playwrights to mix tragedy and comedy also flouted Aristotle. Alexander Pope wrote Preface to Shakespeare in 1725. Pope praised Shakespeare's genius in this preface, but he also accused him for many faults, like confusion of characters and persons, wrong application of speeches, etc. Addison wrote essays on Milton's Paradise Lost. Addison finds beauty and respect for the rules of classical writing in Paradise Lost. William Wordsworth wrote Preface to Lyrical Ballads, first in 1800 and then in 1802. Wordsworth writes in this preface that he chose the subject of incidents and situations from common life in the anthology of poems, Lyrical Ballads. He also chose the language really used by common people for the poems. Imagination has also been used as a tool in writing the poems. The ordinary things have been presented to the people in a special manner. Low and rustic life was chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil and feelings exist in a state of simplicity. The language of these people has been adopted because such men communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is derived. They are less under the influence of social vanity and therefore they convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. Such a language is better than that used by poets who indulge in gaudy expression. Each poem in the book Lyrical Ballads has a worthy purpose. Wordsworth writes that his habit of meditation has given shape to his feelings. All good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. A poet who has thought long and deeply has organic sensibility, and greater value can be attached to his poems. During childhood, the notion of death or philosophical subjects are obscure for a child, so few poems have simple elements. The poems in lyrical ballads are different from the popular poetry in the sense that here feelings developed gives importance to action and situation rather than action and situation to the feelings. The subject chosen to write a poem is very important. A human mind can be excited without the application of gross and violent stimulants. With the changing time, people living in cities crave for extraordinary incidents. The literature and theatrical exhibitions of the country have conformed themselves to such a tendency of life and manners. The invaluable works of elder writers like Shakespeare and Milton have been driven into neglect by frantic novels, sickly and stupid German tragedies, and extravagant stories in verse. Wordsworth thinks upon this degrading thirst after outrageous stimulation. He also thinks that time is approaching when the evil will be systematically opposed by men of greater powers and with far more distinguished success. What is a poet? To whom does he address himself? And what language is to be expected from him? He is a man speaking to men. He is a man with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm, and more tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul. He is a man pleased with his own passions, and who rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him. A poet also adds a disposition to be affected more than other men by absent things as if they were present. Also, an ability of conjuring up in himself passions. A poet has acquired a greater readiness and power in expressing what he thinks and feels. It will be the wish of the poet to bring his feelings and expression similar to those of the persons whose feelings he describes, and by using language that gives pleasure. He will apply the principle of selection, and he will remove the painful or disgusting in the passion. It is impossible for the poet to produce upon all occasions language fitted for the passion. He should consider himself as in the situation of the translator. A poet considers man and nature essentially adapted to each other, and the mind of man as naturally the mirror of the fairest and most interesting qualities of nature. Aristotle said that poetry is the most philosophic of all writing. Its object is general truth, carried alive into the heart by passion, not needing any external testimony. Poetry is the image of man and nature. The poet writes to give immediate pleasure to a human being. This producing immediate pleasure is an acknowledgement of the beauty of universe. It is a task light and easy to him who looks at the world in the spirit of love. Poetry is the breath and finer spirit of all knowledge. A poet binds together all the things by passion and knowledge, the vast empire of human society, as it is spread over the whole earth and over all time. The objects of the poet's thoughts are everywhere. He will follow wheresoever he can find an atmosphere of sensation in which to move his wings. Poetry is the first and last of all knowledge. It is as immortal as the heart of man. The discoveries of a chemist, botanist, mineralogist can also be proper objects of the poet's art, and a poet can lend his divine spirit to it. This was Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads. S.T. Coleridge wrote the book Biographia Literaria and published it in 1817. It is a mixture of autobiography, philosophy, psychology, and literary criticism. P.B. Shelley wrote A Defense of Poetry in 1821, and it was published in 1840. In this essay, Shelley analyzes the inner essence of poetry and the reason of its existence. He argues that poets should communicate the pleasure of their experiences to the community. John Ruskin coined the term pathetic fallacy in volume 3 of his work Modern Painters, published in 1856. The term means attribution of human emotions or conduct to non-human nature. Matthew Arnold gave the touchstone method by saying that the best guides to excellent poetry are the lines and expressions of the great masters. They act as touchstones for judging high poetic quality. T.S. Eliot's famous essay Tradition and Individual Talent, published in 1919, lays emphasis on tradition as tradition carries an order. This historical knowledge of tradition is important for a poet as the tradition makes an organic whole. The impersonal theory of poetry, given by T.S. Eliot, implies that artistic creation is a process of depersonalization. A poet is only a medium in creating poetry from emotions and feelings. So the mind of the poet should remain unaffected, and the personal emotions of the poet should not be expressed. So the creation of poetry should involve the extinction of personality of the poet. I. A. Richards wrote the book Principles of Literary Criticism, published in 1924, in which he attempted to establish a systematic basis for the study of literature. In 1929, Richards published the book Practical Criticism, in which he emphasized upon the close reading method of literature. This practice of close reading had a great impact on the new critics. During the 1940s, new criticism became an institutionalized approach in academia. John Crowe Ransom, 1888 to 1974. Ransom published a series of essays entitled The New Criticism, published in 1941. Ransom argued that any historical studies like literary backgrounds, biography, literary sources, etc., should be excluded from the analysis of a work. The focus should be on the text, that is, the words on the page. Feminist Criticism. Under feminist criticism, Virginia Woolf comes first here. In her essay, A Room of One's Own, she raised issues such as the social and economic context of women's writing and the need to establish a female literary tradition. Intellectual freedom and financial freedom both are needed by women writers. Roman Ingarden wrote The Literary Work of Art, published in 1931. He depicted the text as a totality made up of several strata, from the level of the word to that of the schematized aspects. Clint Brooks. He wrote in the book The Well-Wrought Urn, published in 1947. Even the most direct and simple poet is forced into paradoxes far more often than we think. He differentiates between beauty of any particular item and beauty of the poem considered as a whole. He says it is in the terms of structure that we must describe poetry. The structure here means structure of meanings, evaluations, and interpretations, and the principle of unity which informs it seems to be one of balancing and harmonizing connotations, attitudes, and meanings. Roland Barthes, a French literary critic and theorist, wrote The Death of the Author, published in 1968. In this essay, Barthes argues that a literary work should be separated from its author or creator, and his or her identity should not interfere with the reading or criticism of work. Harold Bloom wrote The Anxiety of Influence, a theory of poetry, published in 1973. The influence of precursor poets creates a sense of anxiety in living poets. Strong poets create their own original work in spite of the pressure of influence of tradition. This was a statement kind of contrary to T.S. Eliot's statement. Walter Benjamin published the work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction in 1935. In this essay, Benjamin argues that a mechanical copy of any work of art diminishes the aesthetic value of the original work. A copy lacks the authenticity of its existence in a particular time and space. Thank you.